So yeah, according to your career, I'm looking back right now, I would emphasize the position that you developed in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the National Board of Fight Against Drugs. Exactly, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 1996, in which you revived cooperation agreement with other countries, including Colombia. How all that work helped in the success of the peace process that is currently being developed in Colombia? How do you see the situation in Colombia right now?
Well, I think it is a real result of hope. I mean, I always say that Latin America especially is the first continent that has been declared itself as a non-nuclear continent, and that was through the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and that has a lot to do with disarmament and how the position is among the neighbors. I think we are a region that specifically has a lot to give to the world, and of course the case of Colombia was one of the biggest afflictions and problems that we always said it's something needs to be resolved. And we have been, of course, since even our position right now in the United Nations, we have supported immediately since the beginning how the United Nations has to be focused even in this part of resolving the issue of non-combatants and coming into a sphere where Colombia will finally start its peace procedure. So we have been in a certain way, and since those times also working in the region, how to address this issue of drug trafficking even as a major problem. As you know, Uruguay even is one of the countries that has a very particular position in this. In the United Nations we have been heard and our voice has been standing strong in the sense that we need to recognize that the fight against drugs has failed. In our point of view, it's not only a matter of fighting against and putting people into jail for all these situations, but addressing really the problem. And Uruguay stands for a comprehensible solution of the problem, but also addressing the fact that we need to see that the factors that nowadays intervene in a very complex problematic need to be revisited. And the case of Colombia has matched very much our position in saying, look how these conflicts and these situations of organized crimes, narco-traffics, and a lot of positioning in the attempt to go against the well-being of people is where we stand. As you know, unfortunately, Latin America is one of the most uneven continents in the world, and we even have countries where the difference between the rich and the poor is very strong. And plus, in this lack of uneven societies, you add the other point of a conflict, and it's very bad. We are very surprised how the Colombians managed to go along such a long conflict and even in a certain way overcoming many of its effects. It's remarkable how the Colombian people have been able also to resist a situation in which now they are finding a way out, which we all are happy in the region because we think it's what we have been demanding for a long time. And Uruguay particularly has also tried to put its voice in the fact that we are totally engaged and compromised in supporting Colombia to coming out of this bad conflict and so long-standing in years of deteriorating the country and the peaceful living of people. So,
well, maybe changing a bit of subject, but still standing with your professional career. Well, as a matter of fact, as you told us before the interview, your first assignment as a diplomat was here in East Berlin. Well, not here, when this was separated in two different cities. So with that experience in mind, how much has the city changed in these last almost 3 decades? And what would be for you the greatest difference between 1989 and today's Berlin, aside from not having a wall separating it, of course?
Well, I think the difference is obviously it's dramatic. I sometimes feel like like a dinosaur that came back to the world after you've been extinguished, and you come to a city that you say, this is where I have been 30 years or 25 years ago. Thank God it has been a dramatic change in the material side, let's say, because I never forget that Berlin also has been a city that has suffered a lot, not only the division, ideological division of the world, but at the same time the consequences of war. This is a city that has been almost 70, almost 80% of its structure totally annihilated. So when you see what this Berlin was after 1945, then when you see when it had to deal with a division and how it was positioned in the inside and in the other one. And now you see a total reunified city in which there's no more that sense of, radical division between one side and the other. And physically, you even have a sense to explain, for example, what you have in the Bernauer Straße, that is the sort of prolongation of some tracks where the wall used to be there. That's incredible because it tries to show you that at the end it's a message. The walls that still exist in this world do not need to be existing. And I think the message Berlin tries to give is precisely that. It's the need to integrate differences and the need to minimize those differences. So if you build the walls, what you do is cut the communication. And you constantly want to say, you know what, I don't want to deal with your problems. My problems or my way of seeing is this, and you stay on the other side and try to resolve it in another way. So the biggest message that I think Berlin is giving nowadays is precisely that. Integration is part of the solution. Now, if you disintegrate, you make conflicts much more stronger, and you tend to go to a lack of solution. So it all implies all that, because I have that, I reaffirmed the feeling that what Berlin has done, in spite of many challenges, is also become with a very strong message that there's still hope that we can rebuild the totally destroyed societies, and that hope is alive, and Berlin is the expression of that.
So we're moving on to the relationship between Uruguay and Germany. So to start with some recent news, we saw very recently Bundespräsident Joachim Gauck visiting Uruguay to commemorate 160 years of diplomatic relations between both nations. How have the relations between Germany and Uruguay changed over the years, particularly these last 20 years?
Well, it's also been part of that evolution. During those 160 years, of course, many historical facts happen among us. We were, let's say, in the shining side, and we were also in the dark side. Uruguay practically did not have relations with Germany in the First World War. In the Second World War, we broke relations with the Axis countries. And of course, during the last years, and when we say the last decades, is when we recovered our democracy, when also Germany was in its process of reunification. So I find that both countries stood in the same place according to values. For example, the respect for human rights, the need to address the needy, the fact that you also need to make... we fight a little bit in who has the birthplace of the welfare state. And we always say that it was Uruguay because in 1904, more or less, when we started a lot of encouraging facts to change and make out of my country, let's say in that way, not only a progressive land, but where the rights even of women, it was one of the places where women had the right to vote first. It's where we eliminated the death penalty, is when we started in a certain way also thinking of the separation of religion and state, and where we achieved many important issues that even have to do with free education, and the structure of the country was totally positioned in a way that we received immigrants, and also some of those immigrants were very decisive and important because they were Germans that did a lot of things in my country. The first Deutsche Schule in South America was opened by the Germans in Montevideo. And then we had many scientific and important people like Justus Liebig, who was the inventor of the corn, well, it derived into the corned beef, but it was the meat extract. And there's a place that last year in the UNESCO meeting in Bonn, that is the cultural and industrial landscape of Fray Bentos, that used to be, we in Uruguay were called the kitchen of the world, because most of the production of that sort of canned meat came from this place, Fray Bentos, was due to the invention of this German Justus Liebig. And then we had many other contributions like Alberto Berger, that was another German that we imported. The government told him to come and work for us in genetics and many other important issues for a country that produces food and quality food, and where in all that, in that interaction of important contributions by Germans, we achieved also a very important standing point as a food producer country. And we recognize that during those 160 years, many things have happened. Thank God we had the great honor to have the visit of Bundespräsident Joachim Gauck. And he even said, well, I am very happy to see that you are almost the anchor of stability in a region where we, in many ways, of course, have evolutionated. Problems would always exist, and situations of crisis is like the permanent being, but we know that we have learned how to live in very demanding times. And where we stand, Uruguay is like, in many ways, with those very strong ties with Germany that we also want to extend to a higher point, because my president will also be coming in February to Germany, that we think it's where we stand. When you can have that unique kind of friendship where both sides have a sort of win-win situation, it's very difficult. But where we position ourselves as the second smallest country in South America, the smallest Spanish-speaking country, but where we are standing also in the fact that we need to get together in the solutions of the future problems where we have to stand. That's where we see that Germany and Uruguay have a common ground, and where we think, of course, it's much more to do, but we are happy that work where we are standing and the closeness of our governments right now is making that important difference, and where we think we have still a lot to do, but we already have a very important platform from where to start. And of course, there are many challenges and there are many issues that both countries have in their own geopolitical framework, but we know that when there are more challenges is when you have the chance to be happy about the small success that you can achieve.
So because Germany is the most important Uruguay's partner in Europe, you can say, what does Your Excellency consider to be the most important issues of cooperation between both countries and right now, and in which areas do you think that there is still space for improvement more, to be more?
Well, we always say that Germany is the land of ideas, and we also think in a certain way we are also a land of many ideas, Because sometimes people don't know that, for example, we are the country that produces more software in the region. That comes out of, you know, the knowledge and the result of people. But at the same time, we think that addressing all those new challenges, especially where we can get together in innovation, where we can start even doing plans together of how to address new problems. There are many problems in the educational field where Uruguay still needs to address a lot of solutions. But we are starting to work together with the Germans in what is called the incorporation of the dual formation. It's the way the Germans have resolved also a way to address the problem of unemployment in young people, and how you can combine theory and practice. And then we need to also start putting that system so we can use it more in Uruguay. We are working on that. We are working also on seeing how to relate more the universities from both countries. And we are also seeing how we can make it that more students come to study to Germany, but also that some Germans can go to study in Uruguay. We have a different kind of approach in which we need to, first of all, the real authors of integrations are people. If you don't do things with people, it's very difficult that countries even get together. So the basic motor of that is when you start engaging people in doing things together in different countries, and that's even part of globalization, but in the good sense, in the sense that you can also protect people and address the different challenges that we all have. We are in a very, of course, you know, difficult world in which the issue of refugees and many others are affecting extremely the quality of people's lives, and where we are seeing important lessons even now in Rio de Janeiro, the Olympics, and where you can find that a lot of people that live under too much pressure and many ways of challenges can go along. And that's where we think that we can also work together with Germany in all that new sphere of different challenges where we are standing. But the main would be how to together produce better quality food, we are the last, how do you say, agricultural frontier in the world, where we have more or less, 14 million cows. Each one of them has like 2 soccer fields, and they are naturally fed. So we need to address too that there are new challenges to produce food for the next future, and also to protect the environment. We are very close to Germany in those views that we need to really be addressing in very concrete ways how to resolve the problems of climate change, how to resolve the situation of deterioration of the environment, and how we can also work on that. Uruguay is also one of the countries that has been more effective in the incorporation of renewable energies. We're in the front line of that, and we have already incorporated solar and wind energy and many other forms in which we can establish that the decarbonization, and where we have to go in together to protect and make of this a less contaminated world, we stand by. So I only see a lot of fields where we have points of contact, where we can really make a difference, and where I insist that we are talking about a unique relationship in which there is still a long way to go.
Okay, so changing now to the subject of cultural diplomacy, which is, as you know, the main purpose and the main goal of our organization. We will start by a simple question. How would you define cultural diplomacy, and what does it mean to you?
Well, I think that, of course, cultural diplomacy is the basic instrument to make causes of conflict less achievable, and where you can also make that the people that are in conflict could, at the end, really resolve that conflict. But since that is sometimes a very, very complicated issue, I would say that through cultural diplomacy, you can find a way to resolve and at the same time ease certain differences that make out of this world sometimes a non-comprehensive place. Many times, because of difference of culture, conflicts are created that simply have no sense of being. Sometimes it's a non-understanding that creates the conflict. And when people start talking, and when people start, admitting their differences, is when you start getting into a common ground and trying to resolve them. History has shown that, of course, the situation in a certain way has always tried to be the preponderance of one through the other one, and trying to make maybe a sort of imperialistic domination of one culture into the other. And that is something that has totally been seen as going nowhere. Because if you try to impose, then the other one will have to be the one who services towards that imposition, and you will never have a level in which you can have a dialogue. And if you do not have a dialogue, you have an imposition. So cultural diplomacy needs and tries to address that, because it's the only way in which you can find a common ground. And understanding is the basics of cultural diplomacy. If you do not get an understanding, you are in a situation that you're not willing to address the problem. So I find that the challenges are very big, because, of course, one of the main issues where we are standing is the lack of understanding and sometimes the imposition of solutions from certain sides, which not necessarily are the ones that have to be predominating. So in a certain way, cultural diplomacy tries to be like that balance, in where you need to find that if you go too much on one side of this sort of interest, or this sort of presumption of domination, you will be going against somebody else. So it has to do a lot also with protection of minorities. It has to do with the protection of difference. It has to do with the addressing of the main challenges, because if you have a different opinion, does not mean that you're right. If I have another opinion and if I want to convince you, I will try to dominate you. And that is not what I think where we have to go. I think that we have to go to a basic understanding where it's not only an ideal world, because idealization is also sometimes that goes to the other side. But we need to address that in the dialogue, for example, of religions, and in the dialogue of cultures, in the understanding of all that, is where the next world really lies, with one of its strongest challenges. And if we do not try to, ease those differences, the only thing we are doing is accelerating a confrontation that we all know more where we are standing. We know this is the only planet, or the only thing that can destroy by itself. So I find that it's something that we need to take the risks out in order to facilitate the solutions to the problems.
So yes, if we think the concept of cultural diplomacy, we can say that is the tool to achieve conflict resolution and peace. So can you give us an example of a time during which you were involved in successful cultural dialogue? Or?
Well, we tried to in a certain way. An example that we have is when we had a sort of distancing with Argentina in an issue of something that was being created as a pulp plant in my country, and we had a sort of, I wouldn't say that we were going to get into war, but we were in a very tense situation. We started using elements of putting together both countries, like two cultural expressions that have to do, like for example, tango and candombe are one is typically from Uruguay and the other one is shared with Argentina. And we started working on that and how to put those as our elements that united us. So, and sometimes it might look naive, it might look even with lack of real interest, but it's always a pretext when, or an unused situation. You would never think that the relationship between China and the United States began with ping pong, and then you say, well, what was that all the story about? But at the same time is when you say, well, those kinds of approximations of getting those issues generally tend to give a sort of way out that sometimes it's not seen. I was also involved, let's say, in the times in which we also changed, because Uruguay has made a face of changing. We had relations with Taiwan, and then we started passing relations to the People's Republic, and I think that was also a very important time in which we tried to make a difference. But the basic maybe was in the United Nations when we started addressing how to protect better peacekeepers in the fields of operations, and even recognize that the people that work around the United Nations are very much always in a very vulnerable situation, in the sense that you have to be in the middle of a conflict, and not necessarily sometimes when you don't have to. It's not only a matter of neutrality, but it's also a matter of getting compromise with the people that you have to protect. And I think that's one of the biggest values, and maybe that I found that during my career it's still something that it has not found a solution, but it's still a problem that is there, and that where you see that in all the conflicts that we have, generally more and more people that make the difference are taking the first line in the conflicts, not only doctors, pilots, people that drive planes, the people that are in the verge of a situation in which they can, from one day to the other disappear, but they are on a mission that they believe it is part of. So I think that it is also very sad to find out that civilians have been in the last decades the biggest victims of conflicts, and it's not an issue in which it's anymore like it was. But I think we still have the challenge to try to address all those issues, and where sometimes certain interests predominate still in the making of them.
Well, you mentioned before the Bangladesh tradition of, should we say, of Uruguay. A long time ago it was death penalty or women's rights. Today it is abortion, same-sex marriages, or recreational marijuana. These are regarded as between the most progressive laws regarding these issues in the whole world. What reasons, or maybe best, what characteristics do you think that Uruguay has that explains this progressive politics?
I think it comes a little bit from history. We had the father of our way of being Uruguayans, we called him José Pepe Artigas, who was a man who used to have his expression like los más infelices serán los más privilegiados. That means the people that are not well off will be the ones that will receive the privileges. So and even there was an exodus. The people followed him when he decided to leave, and the people went and followed him, and that was a unique case in history. So sometimes we find that we, the Uruguayans, have that sort of feeling that we came in a certain way to make a difference according to certain issues. And excuse me, we don't think that we are the enlightened or nothing like that. But we think that it is remarkable that in the most uneven continent we have made the most even society. And the progress Uruguay has found is that, well, if you say nowadays there are some countries where maybe 0.5% of the population owns more than half of the gross national product. And the distribution of income is also a situation that it's not only if you put yourself into the conflictive side, if you are to be, 100% capitalist or a socialist in another sense, but it's to a standing where you want to have a certain basis where you need to, have the rules being respected by all, and where we have the lowest level of corruption in the region. So I find those are particular values that the people get to build together. Maybe it's because also we have been a melt pot, and we have been like the country where immigration has made us who we are, because we had people escaping from Spain in the times of Franco. We have people escaping from Italy in the times of Mussolini. And we have many situations even, and we have been the country that has first assimilated the escaping Jews even. And it makes a lot of sense to say that, well, if all those people came to find the protection of a state, maybe that enhanced all that, they found that that was their place, their refuge. But all that, as I say, it comes a little bit from history, because we have always tried to be maybe the place where the less privileged can find a way in our society. We are still working on the solution, because we have found a country like in 2005 Uruguay inaugurated a time of leftist governments that is considered by the Frente Amplio, and that means that the point of looking was to restore in a certain way how that country that has been so protective could find some answers. And from almost 40% of poverty, we have gone down to 12% nowadays. There are many challenges. There are many issues in which you have to say, what is the purpose then of going in this direction if you really are? But we are in a certain way an exception to all that, in where I restart with thinking it's something we really have to address in the whole of Latin America, that there are certain problems of inequality that cannot longer go along in the way they are. But Uruguay, many say, because it is a small country, maybe has found a more concrete solution. But it's maybe the challenge that we all have to in a certain way build a better future, and where we say that the state is an instrument. When you start talking that we need less state for everything, well, sometimes in certain societies you cannot go along without a certain obligation to make uneven match in a certain way.
So yeah, finally, I would like to ask you, to Your Excellency, that because your whole career is dedicated to international relations, And what advice would you give to the young people who are interested in start with a career in international relations or diplomacy?
Like us, for example.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, because it's hard to address, because it's always one is the product of its times, and in a certain way I find it that what you have right now and how the world is configured in a certain way, it is not easy. It has not been easy even for us, or when I started, because let's say I'm in a certain way the transition into the new world in which everything changed. When I started, even the computers were not in existence. So now you have a much more massive way of getting information, and you have even the entitlement of finding you yourself. I don't know if I would say the truth, but at least you can get very close to a better picture through a lot of investigation and a lot of looking out for elements that I think it's very important. But at the same time, I find that there's a sort of translocation of everything, and the concept of being part of a certain community is very difficult to settle down nowadays, because if you're closed in your computers or whatever, you can be working from any part of the world. Especially if you go to Uruguay, where we have the fastest transmission system. But I mean, if one really has to see how everything is going, it is very hard even to establish a self-opinion, because you are so overloaded in this moment of information from so many sides that it is very difficult. But my biggest, I would say, recommendation would be, don't look at the picture. See the film, see the whole thing, and get the whole history from the beginning to the end, and then make a conclusion. Because sometimes when you just see the picture, you have something detained in time, and you don't really have the sense, because sometimes one can be aggressive, sometimes one can be bad, and the words are very strong and change sometimes people's minds. And in this study, it has a lot to do with other people and with other cultures. And the main thing, it also has to be very, very, very careful that sometimes with anything that you say or what you do, you can harm somebody else, and you never know. I mean, it's not that you have to be, this is so risky, but my best counsel would be that don't stay in the picture, watch the movie, and get the whole picture of the situation. Because sometimes things are not how they are presented to you. Sometimes things have very other ways of finding the real reason of why everything came into something. And I think that international relations, specifically since it is such a moving and changing factor, it's something that you have to be very much aware that not always the basis of certain reasoning have to be still kept, and sometimes the worst to find is people willing to make that change. But you are like in the middle person. You are the one that maybe once has to go into a certain goal to try to find something to be turned into that way, and maybe you never know if you're going to be successful in that. But the thing that you have to be very much in compliance is that you are aware that you are honestly trying to get into the solution. And I find that that's where one sometimes because of all that influence that you now have of so many elements that can be put into the picture, you're the one who has to say, well, I find this is the right thing, and once you find that's the right thing, stick up to that. But it has a lot to do with elements of justice, maybe, or many other things. But this is a career, or this is a way of doing things that sometimes subtracts you a lot of reality. So sometimes you are in certain situations in which you are not really you or something like that, but you need to always keep the structure to make yourself be honest with your own values. And I find that that's not an easy task, but it's the main purpose of trying to be a good facilitator in order to resolve the issues that are given in our hands to resolve.